Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Welcome to the Open Door. Jim Hannick here with co-host Matthew Bartko and good friends Mario Ramos-Ureyes and Christy Yao. We'll also have a guest or two, returning guest or two, and Christy will introduce them after our opening prayer. Come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful and kindle in them the fire of your love. Send forth your Spirit, and they shall be created, and you will renew the face of the earth. Lord, by the light of the Holy Spirit, you've taught the hearts of your faithful. In the same Spirit, help us to relish what is right and always rejoice in your consolation. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. Christy, you are in the lead today. Tell us about the guest that's with us and the guest that might join us shortly and get us launched.
Great. So happy to be here. Happy Friday, everyone. We're going to be talking about socialism again, which is very exciting. We have our two esteemed guests, Vasil Cvetkovski, who is the press secretary of the Socialist Party of America and PhD candidate in political science. And we hopefully will have Chase, forgive me if I'm mispronouncing his name, I've tried really hard a lot of times. I'm not sure I've gotten it right yet. Chase Padusniak. And he is a contributor on PPOS. So, real excited to have them both today. Should we start out with just kind of talking about what capitalism versus socialism is? Vasil, do you want to tackle that?
He's got his mic off. There he is.
Well, first of all, I would like to ask you guys what you guys think capitalism is, and then we'll go from there.
Okay, well, I can give my kind of interpretation of capitalism. So I've seen some awesome, pyramid charts representing capitalism versus socialism, and capitalism is basically one person's on top, and then the workers are like a cheerleading pyramid. I'm probably the only one who's ever been a cheerleader in here, I'm guessing. But you have and it's usually I don't know, I was one of the girls on the bottom because I was kind of stocky. And then it's usually then another row, and then someone on top. And that's basically what capitalism is. It's you're on the backs of the workers. And obviously this isn't right, but it's where we are right now. So, Matthew, do you want to give your take?
Matthew also is being extra shy. He's got his mic off.
Jim, why don't
just
you
trying
give your
to calm down on background noise. My apologies. I was messaging with Chase, and he's going to be running a little bit late, but hopefully he will be able to join us by the end of the show. As far as my understanding of an idyllic capitalism, capitalism as it should be, would be valuing a minimum of regulation on an otherwise free market to allow capital to freely flow in that market, ideally spurring a diversity of investment. Unfortunately, the nightmare that capitalism often turns into is a fight against that regulation, which allows wealth to then concentrate in ever-narrowing circles until you end up with a oligarchy that can hardly be considered a free market. I think if we regulate with the goal of information parity and the goal of having widely dispersed capital, the ideal of a as free as possible market is something that could be striven for, but that doesn't seem to be supported in a lot of people who are calling themselves capitalists these days, unfortunately.
All right, so I can give my take now if you guys want.
That'd be awesome.
And
unless, Jim, you want to say anything.
On the show. You guys are great. In the first place, we don't really define capitalism through private property and markets, because market mechanisms were around for hundreds of years before capitalism, and they will be around after capitalism. And so was private property around for many, many years before capitalism, and it will be around after capitalism. What we define it, and what we see as the defining characteristic of this system, is the employee-employer contract. That's what exists that's specific to capitalism. Whereas before you had the gentry and all these other ruling classes that would socially own production along with the bourgeoisie. In this case, it is solely individuals who own the production, who own the land, who own the profit that's generated off production, and they sign other people on through this employee-employer contract. And what that does is it makes the labor themselves a commodity. So what is the value of a commodity? It's the minimum amount that you can reproduce it. And that is why workers in the system don't have money, because their wages are calculated such that they're not there to take over the boss's position. They're there to remain in their own position. They're calculated so they pay the minimum amount for the person to keep coming back to work, to not revolt, and to accept their place. There's no way out of that. We had, for example, every family used to have one wage, and now we have women working, every family has two wages. So they've doubled their income. But their position has remained exactly the same because their cost of living has gone up. So that is how we define capitalism, solely through that contract and the consequences, the division of labor that it creates. Now, the question over what to do about that. In the first place, the contract needs to be abolished, and what is the best way to do that? That's the easiest way to transition to another economy is through the worker-owned cooperatives. If the workers manage the workplace democratically, then you don't have an employee-employer contract. The cooperative is self-directed by the people, and the people who generate the surplus are the ones who disposition it. You can have private property, you can have private banking and so forth. Those can be weeded out very slowly from the system, and you can have full social ownership. But that is our plan for a peaceful transition in the Socialist Party of America, is to support those worker self-directed cooperatives. And if you had that kind of economy, you wouldn't have these other problems that we generate where you see the workers on the bottom. It's not really capitalism itself that does that. It's the consequences of the division of labor produced by capitalism. It cannot not do that, is what the system does. Can we regulate the market? Can we have a free market? No. In the first place, it's not in the workers' interest to have a completely free market because their wages are calculated by those market mechanisms. In the second place, it's not in the interest of the ruling class to have a free market either. If you're a business owner and you won a competition on day one 250 years ago, the first thing you want to do on day two is regulate the market. You want to give yourself advantages that other people don't. And that is why you always end up with a very regulated market. The vast majority of regulations are there to defend the interests of the business owner, not the worker. So that is part of the system's nature as well. You've never had a free market, and it's not possible to have one.
Vasil, can I offer you an example? Here in Los Angeles, and I think throughout the Southwest, there's a semi-fast food outlet known as El Pollo Loco, the crazy chicken. And it's very successful, and very often El Pollo Loco is hiring, and when they hire, they do pretty well because they have a profit-sharing system. And what about that? Suppose you have an organization and you have a lot of people interested in working for the organization, and you interview them, and they say, well, I like the chicken, that's for sure. But what I like best of all is the better we do, the higher our wages go. What would you say to those poor, benighted people?
I believe the general question is about employee-owned stock companies or ESOPs and other forms of companies. The cooperative.
I don't know about that. All I know is that they share the profit. As the company does better and better, the wages go upper and upper. You have the same sort of thing at something that's the local rival of El Pollo Loco, In-N-Out Burger. In-N-Out Burger does very, very well. I think their burgers are better than the chickens at Pollo Loco. But once again, there you have a profit-sharing plan. As the company does better, the workers' salaries go up. Now, a lot of people would say, I've never worked for either. I worked for a so-called nonprofit university, which was actually making a profit all the time. But a lot of people say, there are a whole lot of people that maybe they like to talk about worker ownership, but in fact that involves a whole lot of things that they don't really want to do, and they'd be actually quite happy with a profit-sharing system. Just your thoughts on that.
If I may, I think that the big problem, or one of the big problems with a lot of modern societies, is that we do want benefits without obligation. So, on the one hand, the benefit that some people might see to a comprehensive profit-sharing arrangement is that they reap the rewards of ownership without any of the responsibility of ownership. Whereas, if I understand both distributists and democratic socialists and their ilk, the objective would be not just to have a full share of the benefits of your productive labor, but to also then have a democratic say in the management of that labor. It's not just enough to share in the profitability of the corporation, but workers should also have a say in the management of that corporation. If we're going to talk about, a distributist or democratic socialist ideal of, the worker having full dignity in their work.
Well, there's nothing that would prevent a group of workers from pooling what they have and going beyond sharing in profit and in fact to determine the direction of the organization. Other than it would be difficult to do it. There's nothing to prevent it. Of course, it's difficult to start a business, and all kinds of businesses are started all the time. So instead of waiting for the state to do what the state very likely isn't going to do, maybe what the American Solidarity Party should promote is interchanges of workers who would like to have worker ownership, and we could help them to do that very sort of thing.
So do we want to segue into one of our next questions, which is about distributism? Sorry?
Can I respond?
Oh,
sure,
yeah.
Please do.
In the first place, they are prevented from pursuing workers' ownership. They're prevented from the way that their wages are calculated, even with the profit sharing mechanism. As for self-managed workplaces, and there's a lot of research on them, they're promoted in every business textbook in this country. The reason that they're promoted is because they offer a way for companies to make workers happier, because everybody likes management and ownership. If workers say they don't, it's because they're socially anxious because they've never had it before. And they never thought it was possible to have it before because they've been wage workers their whole lives. But nobody in a worker self-directed cooperative goes, I wish I wasn't the owner. Nobody in a self-managed workplace wishes, I wish I had a boss to tell me what to do. So those are part of our nature, that we want these things. And if we don't want them, it's because we're socially nervous about them. Like in Socrates' cave, where the person doesn't want to come out of it because that's all they know their whole lives. That's what we're taught from school, is to accept private property in that relationship in the workplace, depending on where we grew up. As for these profit-sharing mechanisms and all that, okay, Okay, excellent. But we have to realize what they're being used for. Self-managed workplaces are being used to save companies a lot of money and corporate executives by getting the workers to commit extra responsibilities at the cost of their limiting even further their social mobility in the workplace, such that they cannot become corporate executives, which makes them happier and they accept it just because they have that democratic responsibility. But it comes at their cost. It doesn't come at the company's cost. Now, as for profit sharing and other things, okay, excellent. But we shouldn't be under the delusion that that's somehow going to change the relationship between workers and owners, right? The people who work at In-N-Out or people work at a Polo Loco, they're just as likely to do as good as the owners of those companies, the major shareholders, as slaves back in the day were able to own their own plantations. They can dream about that, but they're never going to be able to do that under this system. And I think that is the point that socialists point out. However, we realize that there are ways to do better within the system to get in the maybe lower middle class or in the middle ranks of the middle class, and we tell people to pursue those ways in any way that they can. Because those ways actually breed class consciousness. People who do a little better, they actually want to do even more better. And so they're going to want to become part of they're going to start thinking to themselves, why am I not in the ruling class, and what is keeping me from being there? So all of those efforts are intersectional with socialism, but they do not diminish the goals that we put on the table or the analysis that we bring of capitalism, and we don't interpret their evidence that they show as being evidence that the system can reform itself. We interpret it as evidence that it cannot reform itself, because even when it tries its earnest, it cannot change that relationship. It still can't give workers the right to control their own cost of living, and it still keeps them in the same position.
Now, in the past, there's a slogan that was associated with communists, and the slogan was, "The worse, the better." That is to say, the worse working conditions got, the better things would be, because people would eventually see that they have to have a revolution. Now, somebody might hear you speaking and say, aha, new slogan, the better things are, the worse they are, because if we have anything short of state control, what we're going to have is relatively satisfied workers, and they'll never get to the heart of the problem. And so, well, there's a problem there. Is it there?
I think there's a miscommunication in that when a lot of people hear socialism, they're thinking of Leninism or a Marxist revolution, whereas where a lot of people who are talking socialism these days, they're not talking state control, they're talking worker control. Is that your understanding as well, Vasil? Vasil?
Thank you for this question. I am a Marxist, and so is Richard Wolff, who supports democracy at work. Marxism is a way to analyze the system. It's not its own system or economy or the opinions of Marx on what to do or his labor theory of value or any of that. People wanted socialism, people wanted communism before Marx, and they wanted him after Marx and so forth. It was the class analysis that he brought to human history that is really the defining view of Marxism. And if you read any of the writings that I do, I obviously use that. There's no such thing as a Marxist revolution. There's such a thing as a Marxist-inspired revolution where the workers acknowledge, you might use this class analysis, certainly. Some might do it for their own reasons. Maybe they don't know the class analysis, but it can happen for many reasons. Now, as for the point that you touched on, Jim, the worse the better, that's not true. And I don't know any real socialist that's serious that would say any such thing. We know that the bourgeoisie revolution happened when the bourgeoisie was doing better, not worse, when they were most involved in feudal politics, after they achieved their local government, after they achieved their parliament, after they achieved great investments in their industry and their private machinery. And when they expected all these things and they realized that the system can never provide it for them, that's when they decided to go for a new system. So obviously we want people to do as best that they can under this system, because that is what creates the mentality for a new system in the first place. And that's what Marx said, and that's been backed up by modern political science research. People who are really poor, they have no expectations, they don't want to do better. And people who are really poor disconnect themselves from politics, they don't want to be involved in politics. And how can you do better if you don't want to be involved in politics? You can't. So That's why socialists supported the unions. That's why the New Deal was copied off socialist platforms, right? We didn't get the New Deal in this country by voting for FDR. FDR in 1928 ran as a moderate on race and as a person who wanted to balance federal budgets. We got the New Deal because socialists wanted people to do better. They created the unions. They organized the strikes. They didn't want people to do worse. And we got the New Deal off the platform that they brought to FDR, and they asked him to get these things done. So it's not a true revolutionary line if you don't want people to do the best they can under the current system. That's very offensive, and it's spread out there by bourgeoisie news outlets that we want people to do worse. It couldn't be farther from the truth. And if you look at what we're doing as Socialist Party America, we gather resources that help people form unions, even if they're liberal unions. The CFL.
Well, in terms of miscommunication, I was referring to classical Leninists and classical Stalinists who I think, in fact, were looking for greater and greater social unrest, thinking that with enough social unrest, there actually would be a revolution. But I wanted to fast forward. It seemed to me that you were saying that actually it's management and capitalists who are favoring profit sharing, and they do it as kind of what I'm not sure, a way to release tension or some such. But it seems to me that that amounts to, if in fact there's something good, and people who are owners are favoring that, then it's almost as if somebody's saying, well, you get these half-hearted reforms, and people in control, they like a half-hearted reform. And that would lead some people to say, well, isn't this something like the claim that the better things are actually the worse they are for the worker? Because if you think you're getting someplace with what the system has to offer at its most flexible, you are once again being conned. What's required is a clean sweep, and that leads to the question, who's going to do the clean sweeping? It always seems to me that the idea is that the state will do the clean sweeping. And that's where I think a lot of people get really antsy. Well, what about that Mario Ramos Reyes? He knows more about this than a lot of us.
Well, no, I prefer listening carefully. I think it's very interesting, the exchange here. I'm curious about one thing. What is really the definition of socialism then? Because if we exclude here Leninism, if we exclude the intervention of the state, if you exclude, Stalinism, then what is really this worker ownership? What type of socialism is that? Or is there any place in history that idea was implemented? That's my question. Otherwise, I think the definition of socialism is a moving target. This is not, or this is not, and then we really don't have at least a working notion of what a definite socialism is.
So to answer the question on the first point that Jim made, half-hearted reforms are not bad for the worker; they're bad for the system. Was the point that I made. In the second place, what you asked me, and you said you were excluding Leninism or excluding all this. Oh. Look, the fact that socialism exists as a thing, as a definition, is not in our interest. When the first business owners and the bourgeoisie fought for their revolution, they had no idea they were fighting for capitalism. And when the communalists banded together in the countryside and formed fiefdoms, they had no idea that they were fighting for feudalism. So the fact that we even have this conception of what society is going to be like if workers organize and they want to enrich themselves, that right there is a mistake. So as Marxists, how do we interpret the 20th century? We don't think about whether it was socialism, whether or not, or anything like that. What did they violate, and why was it done from the top down, whereas other revolutions in history, social revolutions, were done from the bottom up? And the reason that we come up with, and we call it surplus analysis, is that there was no basis formed in the beginning for how societies to transition to a new one. The defining characteristic of a social revolution that happens way before the actual social revolution is the introduction of a new property relationship in the workplace. So let's forget about the state and all that. Let's put a hypothetical scenario where workers do form enough self-directed cooperatives that they make up some kind of majority in a community, or 20% of a community, or whatnot, right? So now there's a basis for socialism. They have their own thing that they can point to and say, that's for me in this economy. The economy as a whole is not for me, but that right there is for me. What are those self-directed workers going to think to themselves? The first thing they would find out is that this whole economy and the way that this education system is put forth, it doesn't promote democratic management of production. It promotes private management of production. So they're going to want to lobby for new education reforms. And when they try to make their demands, they're going to find out they do better as a labor association than by individual cooperatives. So they're going to form a new labor association. They're going to find out that political parties are being excluded who could be helping them more than Republicans and Democrats. So they're going to want electoral reform. They're going to find out that the system is harmful to the environment around them, whereas they work in their environment. They entertain themselves and they play in their environment. So they're going to want new national policy. They're going to treat people better, because what is sexism and misogyny and racism to a cooperative? It just creates a toxic work environment. There's no benefit to it. Unlike private property, you can save a lot of money if you can have a society where you can pay people less. So they're going to have new local policy initiated. So now you've started all these conversations that didn't take place before. And how does a real social revolution happen is when, after so many political battles, the positions of the classes start to crystallize around those new debates that are taking place that we're not even talking about right now. And there you will see a new movement take place to move on to a different kind of system. And that happens all the time. Every single time in history you've had two property norms, they clash with each other. Small businesses in this system clash with large businesses. Small business owners don't like their landlord. Why? Right? Workers, self-directed cooperatives don't like the system for the same reasons that small business owners don't like the landlord. They can see what kind of chunk the business takes from them, because workers, self-directed cooperatives are not always worker-owned. Most of them are not worker-owned. They have private shares and state shares and all this investment and all that. But they get to see, look how much I'm making, look how much I'm doing, look how much that guy's making, look how much he's doing. And that creates the mentality that they're going to fight for that extra surplus and fight for more of a position in the economy. If the system can incorporate them and help them, fine, we don't need a new system. But as Marxists, we don't see that happening. We feel like the system is going to try to fight them. And when the system tries to fight them, that's when you'll see a movement for another system that will come from the bottom up, like all other systems did. So we don't need to take over the state and suddenly do a top-down revolution. No, you can very easily regulate the economy and bring democracy to the workplace.
Okay, well, I know we had wanted to talk about distributist. Oh, sorry.
May I ask a following question?
Sure.
What I gather, what you are saying is very interesting. It seems that you haven't defined, or you don't define socialism, because you are going to begin from the bottom up. So you are building your movement from the bottom, and then start the cooperative, the ownership, etc., etc. And then things will happen. Now, the question is, why then you call yourself socialist? If that ideal will come after this society will be built. In other words, it seems to me that your reasoning is inductive. I mean, we are going to start this way of relationship between ownership, relationship between workers in property, but ultimately, then we will have this society which was open this kind of conversation. That's one thing. And another thing I am curious is, what is your view of the human person in this relationship? What is a human person for this movement being built from the bottom up?
Thank you for this question. It's a good question. In the first place, we can't run from the name socialism, because whether it was given to us or by us, it exists. And if you want to be a serious movement, you need to form your own curriculum, and you cannot do a bait and switch in people and tell yourself that you're one thing and then suddenly you're something else. We know that there is no singular socialism, and whatever socialism is built is going to vary in countries, just like it varied in the 20th century. But it has to be built by working class power. If it's not going to change the relationship. The structure of the workplace is what surplus analysis says. What did they do in countries like mine in Yugoslavia and countries like Soviet Union? They gave us indirect control of the company's board of directors. Sometimes the company operated in a market mechanism, sometimes it operated in a state-owned mechanism, but that's really how it operated. Workers had indirect control of the company's board of directors. The relationship between boss and employee stayed exactly the same within the company. And they didn't feel connected to it at all. They got some good services, and a lot of people liked it, fine, but they didn't feel connected to it for the same reason. You have to change the relationship in the workplace, and that changes people's mindsets of how they think about coming into the workplace. Now, what was the second part of your question? Sorry.
What is your view of the human person in this view that you are explaining?
The human person is somebody who wants to be master of his own destiny. He wants economic freedom, political freedom, psychological freedom, and what the human person wants most of all is to do what his abilities dictate them to do. And I cannot promise as a socialist that you will completely see it under socialism, an economy where it's from each according to their abilities. But it's a step in the right direction. As socialists, we're not utopians. We don't try to see that. What we see is going to happen, and what we predict if you introduce this new property relations, you're going to see we're going to exchange today's problems with a set of more manageable problems in the future. And we're going to be more on the way to that new system, or to where somebody is in control completely of their own destiny without outside influence. But a human being is somebody who wants to do what they want. They just don't want to be coerced, is how we see it.
Vasil, is that any different than what the libertarian says?
Socialists invented libertarianism, Jim.
What's that?
Socialists invented libertarianism.
But you're not running from your name. It's just that you're actual libertarians.
Well, that's anathema to many libertarians. Yeah.
Well, it seems to me that in order to connect with people in the American Solidarity Party, you will need to have a richer view of what the human person is. If the human person is fundamentally someone who wants to be free to do what he wants to do, I don't see that as anything particularly attractive. What's critical, it seems to me, is to have some sort of sense of what the good is. And on your view, which strikes me as an extraordinarily reductionist view, the good is simply personal freedom. But one wants to ask, freedom to do what? To be more free? In order to do what?
No, that's an overlapping conversation. It doesn't exclude the fact that you want personal freedom. And I didn't say personal freedom. I said economic freedom, political freedom, and psychological freedom. Right. Personal freedom is on a spectrum that's going to be regulated by the fact that you live in a society, and you're going to be subjected to somewhat of a whim of what that society wants always.
But it won't be a whim, will it? On your view, it won't be a whim.
If people will get together and decide things. But I don't think that personal freedom or the right that you want these other things includes the fact that you're going to try to do the right thing. I think that if you see in the most oppressive situations, in the situations of civil war and all these disasters that happen, people actually come together, right? They form our biggest kinship bonds are formed when we have a problem, when we feel the most politically free and economically free. That's when we think about forming kinships and doing what's best. If we're living paycheck to paycheck and we're always stressing out about being on the streets, we don't think about what's best. So I think those things lead to other mindsets and more thinking about philosophy and thinking about morality and thinking about human conventions. They are derivative of being a politically and economically free animal. As long as you're tied down politically and economically, or financially, you don't think about those things. They don't even come to your mind. What is the right thing to do? How many Americans who are living paycheck to paycheck think to themselves, what is the right thing to do as humanity at the moment? Very, very few.
I disagree. I think that that's a very classist viewpoint. I think that a lot of Americans people just around the world who are living paycheck to paycheck think about what's the right thing to do. I think just as human beings, we constantly question what the right thing is to do. I mean, look at church populations. There are a lot of working class and lower income people in church populations, and obviously they are concerned about what the right thing to do is.
Well, if I may, I think that what you have to consider is that even the American poor isn't particularly poor by the global standard. So if you look at the embattled American middle class, you'll see that the widest variety of political activity actually comes from the middle class. It's one of the things that, being involved in third parties is something I've struggled with the most, is that it seems like the group of people who are most willing to engage in the idea of a different politics is the middle class white man. It's very hard to get buy-in from women. It's very hard to get buy-in from minorities, even if the proposals you're working toward are directly aimed at benefiting their lives. So I think there is something to be said for, at least when your thoughts of what's better and best are reaching the level of activism and actively trying to change them, there's something to be said for having the economic security to invest your time that way and not having the economic incentive not to, like the wealthier people would.
That's a fair point. I think, especially when we're told, in the context of the American Solidarity Party, when we're told time and time again, oh, this will never work. If you want real change, you're just wasting your time. Well, if real change kind of hits you personally, then that's a big incentive not to be involved in something where you're constantly being told you're wasting your time. This isn't real change. So I know we wanted to talk about distributism. Sorry.
Right. That's the fact that we see in the system is that those most vulnerable, they develop a very short-term mindset, even when they think about doing what's right, and that's why you see support for the Democratic Party so striking in minority areas where they can take positions on social issues and gather that support very quickly. Whereas all third parties and almost all third party organizations are, as you said, developed by the upper middle class. Socialists had that problem back in the day where who was the people in charge of the movement? It was always some major general guy who's already top in the military or an intellectual that already was upper middle class. And how do we break that? That goes back to our surplus analysis. The only way that people are going to be involved is if they have some kind of stake and they have some kind of security, and you have to fight for what you can within that system first if you want them to develop any kind of political mindset. Because as long as they're financially insecure, the majority of them just don't have a political, economic mindset and the mindset of getting involved for higher purpose. I think that's absolutely correct, what Matthew said.
Seems to me historically that really progressive, significant socialist movements, and I would just as soon use the term economic democracy as socialist, that those movements really worked hard to change the culture, really worked hard in the arts, really worked hard in literature, really worked hard in terms of neighborhood associations and intermediate groups, that they spread around, that they spoke to any number of cultural institutions and dimensions. For example, there used to be socialist summer camps. There used to be socialist musical organizations. There were a wide range of socialist educational institutions. But over time, and I think this has a lot to do with fallen human nature, the focus became more and more on economics and the understanding of what kind of person would emerge from real change turned out not to be a person who was a broader and more sympathetic and more humane, but the person who had a better salary and more time off. And I think that the best of socialism has oftentimes been reduced to something that I would call a mere economism. And that's why I think from time to time we press you on your view of what the human person is. If the human person as the human person can best be is something that comes out of a process that is wholly economic, I think what we're going to do is have something that's far less than the best that the human person can be.
Well, this point has been that you raised as Buck the Movement. It was Lenin in 1901 that said that the economists are part of the problem, who want to reduce everything to economics. So I don't see it that way. If I look at the socialist movement today, I think we need to use class analysis on how we deal with issues, and everything should be derivative of that. But if you use class analysis, you find out that these social problems are very much linked to economics. And we don't see the distinction between economic inequality and social inequality. They correlate 100%.
Well, let me try this from a different angle altogether, but I hope I'm trying the same point. That noted non-socialist, William F. Buckley Jr., who was the founder of National Review and is probably among the very best-known capitalist intellectuals of his time, said that the thing that was most likely to kill capitalism was the capitalists. And I think he meant by that the freedom that he associated with capitalism is most likely to be lost by capitalists exploiting their position. I can imagine a good many people saying, if anything is going to kill socialism, should it be successfully birthed, it will be the socialists in positions of leadership, because they themselves will be dramatically flawed people. And then from there we might go to Lord Acton's observation that power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely, and from there we might go to Venezuela. So I think any number of people who want to engage in discussion with socialists are looking for some socialist vision of who the best person that persons can be, who that person is. And if the answer is, well, it'll all come clear once the economic struggle is won, then I think a lot of people of my generation will say, that's where I came into the movies.
That's partially absolutely correct. The first part that you said, if your movement is led by a great individual that knows how to mediate disputes and is charismatic, you're probably going to end up with that kind of elitism. And if your movement comes from a political party, which is by definition a very hierarchical institution, you're going to end up with that kind of dynamic. But if your movement is led by labor associations, you will not end up with that kind of dynamic. You're still going to have a power struggle, and you're still going to have people who try to use the system to its own advantages. Like I said, you're going to trade in today's problems for a different set of more manageable problems. But what you should know is this. If you change the relationship in the workplace, the workers aren't going to give it back to you. That's why feudalism couldn't come back. If you change that relationship, that structure, and if the workers have no hierarchy in the workplace, they're not going to give back their self-directed cooperative. So you have no risk of the new system coming back. And the reason why these countries that spent 70 years becoming socialist and all of a sudden could revert back to private property in one day, and it caused a humanitarian disaster. Many people starved after capitalism came back. But the reason it was done so quickly is because the structure of the workplace was exactly the same. All you had to do was transfer ownership of the board of directors to private property. All the change was that the board of directors of a company were indirectly controlled by the workers. That's it. That can very easily go back to capitalism. You can put that system back to capitalism overnight. You cannot bring a system back to capitalism that's based on worker self-directed cooperatives. So that is where our Marxist analysis comes in, that the relationship in the workplace is the core driver of the new system that prevents the old system from coming back. It's not possible for it to come back.
You know, Vasil, if you look to the great labor encyclical of John Paul II, Latin title Laborem Exercens, English on Human Work, there's a metaphor that runs all through it. It's the metaphor of a workman who owns his own tools, has his own workbench, and decides what he's going to make. Now, it's not as if Wojtyła, John Paul II, wanted to have an economy based on carpenters working by themselves, anything but he wanted to stress the point that work itself is an ennobling enterprise, and that we ought to be able to control that enterprise, and that the person is at the heart of that enterprise. And I think that much of what you say shifted in this way and that way, not so very much, is reflective of the goal of worker solidarity and worker self-direction that we find on human work, laborem exercens. Now, that's a very positive point. A point that I'm a little bit worried about as I read your literature is that it seems like it's all Richard Wolff, and there's an old saying, beware the man of one book, and you yourself are saying what we need to do is have worker direction and worker insight and worker leadership. I don't see any of that yet in your literature. I see the thinking of a single individual who is an academic. So perhaps you could allay my fears. I bet you are allaying them right now, but your mic is off.
Our literature that we put out there draws in our own analysis and Richard Wolff's analysis. What you're detecting is, again, something called surplus analysis, which is a form of analysis that came about after the Soviet Union collapsed, when Marxists had to explain why were these things able to transfer back to private property so easily, why did a cult of personality emerge around those leaders, etc. And they came up with a way to analyze the problems of capitalism today and analyze the problems of 20th century capitalism. And we certainly use that analysis in our literature. As for the labor organizations that you say are not in control, of course they're not in control. They don't exist. Our purpose is to educate people on why they need to go out there inform worker self-directed cooperatives. And when you see our website, it's going to have resources on that. There's only two kinds of political parties you can be if you're in it for social change. You can either be a vanguard or an amplifier, right? You can either be the vanguard of your movement and try to build and try to lead it and try to tell it what to do and build it from the top down, or you can be an amplifier that's going to take in the views of the labor associations that are to be once you introduce that new relationship and bring them to the forefront. But as far as new relationships coming, there's always been an intelligentsia or people who, in the beginning, are the ones who conceptualize it and are the ones who try to make it come true out of the old system. The fact that we exist with our ideas is because the system is the one who give us ideas. If I was living under Caesar, I wouldn't have the idea to introduce a new property relationship. It wouldn't even boggle my mind.
Spartacus thought otherwise, did he not?
I don't think so.
I think he did. I think he was looking for something very, very different, although he lived under the Caesars. Aristotle famously says that we'll get rid of slavery only when the shuttle moves on the loom, or maybe it's the loom moves on its shuttle all by itself. That's only the time we'll get rid of slavery. But at the very time that Aristotle lives, Aristotle himself was answering objections from people who opposed slavery and opposed the oligarchy that he favored. I think maybe what Christie has in mind is that every point in the human enterprise, there are those who see through the tyranny that is oftentimes directing the established disorder, and we're not locked into this preconceived idea of how revolution will come about. But I'm a little suspicious here about this Matthew Bartko. I see his icon up here. He is an iconic fellow, and I see him smiling, but I wonder what he has to say.
I'm pondering the irony of a group of people who advocate a distributist economic model that almost entirely relies on Chesterton and Bullock criticizing another movement for having a narrow scope of authors. I think it would benefit both of our movements quite a bit if we were able to generate more and more timely literature to the current world economic order. But I believe toward that notion of distributism, Christy had a question.
Yes, Christy.
Yes. Yeah, we're at 8 minutes and okay. So
typical, isn't it?
Yeah, I guess we'll wrap things up by relating everything back to the American Solidarity Party. So, do we see the American Solidarity Party as compatible with socialism, or do we see it more as a capitalist party? Is it more a distributist party, or is it something else entirely? So I'd like to open that up. I guess, Vasil, if you could go first, and then maybe one of our other guests can give a rebuttal on what they believe the American Solidarity Party is most in tune to.
I'll let other people discuss what the American Solidarity Party is most in tune to. What I will say is the same thing that I said last time. Politics is three-dimensional. There's the foreign policy dimension, economic dimension, and social dimension. It is highly likely that we're compatible in at least one of these dimensions. Peace is a prerequisite to growing working class power, and the American Solidarity Party supports peace. So obviously socialists and people in the American Solidarity Party can work together. There's no doubt about that. That's not up for debate. But as far as what platform you guys think you should promote, I think it's up to you, and I'll leave it to you.
May I interject something?
Please.
Yes. What I heard is very interesting. Again, going back to the socialist approach, I'm going to give the name socialism just a working hypothesis, which begin from let's say, the place we work. which means that we need to transform in order to take ownership. The worker will take ownership, etc. Now, that means that we begin with an economic view of reality, so that when that reality starts changing and I take this leadership as a worker, then the political change will ensue, will come up. So in that sense, what counts is economics, basically, or the material condition of the working class. Now, when I heard you saying these three dimensions, international affairs and economic and social, I didn't hear you talking about politics. Because I'm assuming, correct me if I'm wrong, that politics will be something that come after the economic condition change, and we change the structure, the economic structure of these businesses, if you will, or the economic system. And so my question is, what is the role of politics then in this model?
What I said was those are political dimensions, and the way we think about politics and the issues we bring belong to those three dimensions. As for where the issues that we bring forth come from, that's a separate question, and that does come from the clashes of property within our economy. Why does our education system from first grade on teach us to respect private property? Why does our education system sort of wash down the civil rights movement to talk about the same thing over and over again every year that doesn't talk about class, even though all the civil rights leaders talked about class? That's for that reason, because of who writes the education system and what it's designed to do. And I just explained in my example where the cooperatives are active in a community, how they're going to think differently about social issues. Where did our social inequality come from? It's because you could exploit these people. It was very profitable to do so. If you could erect a single race ruling class, that's what you did. That's what England did. That's what the United States did. Our national issues such as environment. If you're a board of directors that meets in Beijing and they're making a decision that affects Salt Lake City or Las Vegas, they don't care about the environment there. But if you live in that environment and you entertain yourself in that environment, you're more likely to care about it. So that's why environmental activists, you see who they are. They're people who live locally in their environment and work there. So the issues that we're going to have, the political conversations that we're going to have is going to be influenced by what is inside our economy, absolutely. And the conditions of peace add to that, because if we don't have peace, we're never going to have a productive conversation about any of these issues. Does that answer your question, or do I need to be more?
Yes. The reason why I'm asking this question is because I read carefully the mission of the Democracy at Work movement, and I'm very interested in how you present the views. But what I gathered there, I read in Spanish, you have a translation about this mission in Spanish, which says, well, then we need to start changing the economic structure in order to have a political system. So in some ways, that implies, perhaps I'm wrong, that we are conditioned by our economic system so that we start thinking about certain ways because we are somehow trapped in an economic system that make us think that way. If that is the case, then I don't see from the get-go the place of the economic political activity. Because if I'm determined by my social structure, then my freedom to think is completely limited to that structure. And I think that collides with the view that you gave about freedom. In other words, I can go against my own structure because my freedom is not determined by economic conditions.
I do think that the way you think is influenced by your economic structure, of course. That's why I said I would not come up with socialism if I was living in Aristotle's time. to come up with socialism, you needed production to become social production, so you can think about them being socially owned and have that position be viable. Now, here's another thing, though. It is possible, perhaps, to come up with some kind of idea, but it's not viable and it has no basis to exist unless our economic system allows it. And yes, the issues that we have and we discuss are completely influenced by our current economic system. There's no debate for that. Is your freedom limited?
Let me wrap things up here, and I'm sure Sebastian will tack on another 2 minutes. We've been talking a lot about freedom and structure and perspective for analysis. Today's gospel actually is something that confounds historical Marxists, historical liberals, historical conservatives, and the bourgeoisie, and gosh, just about everyone. But it goes to the very heart of our human experience. This is a reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark. Jesus came into the district of Judea and across the Jordan. Again, the crowds gathered around him, and as was his custom, he taught them. The Pharisees approached him and asked, "Is it lawful for a husband to divorce his wife?" They were testing him. He said to them in reply, "What did Moses command you?" They replied, "Moses permitted a husband to write a bill of divorce and dismiss her." But Jesus told them, "Because of the hardness of your hearts, he wrote you this commandment. But from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, no human being must separate." In the house, the disciples again questioned Jesus about this. He said to them, "Whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her, and if she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery." This is certainly a testimony to the centrality of fidelity. And we'll return next week, and I want to thank everyone who participated, and especially Vasil, and I want to commend him for his resoluteness in leading us to discuss an important alternative to the status quo. God bless you all. Come, Lord Jesus, come.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.